Hello everybody, welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today we are going to be doing another book recommendation video. So this video is going to be focused around books that I would recommend to anybody who is a person that's new to the fantasy genre and wanting to kind of start getting their feet wet with the genre. I know it can be a pretty daunting one for somebody who maybe has never really read any fantasy books or, you know, been big in like fantasy TV shows or movies. It can get kind of convoluted with a huge cast of characters, really in-depth, intricate magic systems and political systems, and just like the fact that oftentimes the world building, particularly in high fantasy, is a brand new structure. It's not based in our real world, and so I think it's best to kind of start to get your feet wet with kind of books that are a little more on the easier to digest and easier to understand and quickly pick up on. I'm going to be talking more about books that are more maybe centered in our world, or some high fantasy books that have less convoluted structures to them, and just good ones to kind of like get your intrigue in the genre and get you interested in the magic and whimsical, dangerous, exciting moments that come with this genre. So first, the kind of subgenre that I think is best for people who are completely new to fantasy. Maybe you kind of stick more towards contemporary or thrillers, mysteries, or even historical fiction, that kind of thing. Or maybe you're just not a big reader to begin with, but you're wanting to start right away in fantasy. I think your best bet is to start with historical fiction, because obviously historical fiction is based in our own real world, but kind of in just like a different time period, but you have like the familiarity of your real world and kind of how it works, or like, you know, you can recognize things from different points in history, maybe different places in history. So I've got two to recommend. The first one is actually a trilogy. That is the Winternight Trilogy, and the first book is The Bear and the Nightingale. So this is set in like historical Russia. It follows a young girl named Vasya. So it kind of starts from Vasya's birth, and throughout the trilogy you follow her until she's like in her early 20s. I think this book you follow her from her birth to when she turns 16. And this is in historical Russia, and it is kind of during the time period when Christianity first started really making its roots in the country. And so Vasya lives in a small town that believes in kind of the older spirits and guardians of like the forest and such, like kind of the old folklore stories. And then a young woman kind of marries into Vasya's family, and she quickly starts to banish the belief in kind of the act of giving offerings to like the old spirits and stuff. And when that starts going to the wayside, things start happening, and Vasya is the only one to really be able to see what's actually happening in kind of this like parallel world to Russia that kind of deals with a lot more of the folklore spirits and creatures and stories. And so Vasya has to work with kind of both sides of Russia, the, you know, human side and the more magical side, in order to save her town in this book. I really enjoyed this, and I think it's a good one to start with because it is definitely a lot more like folklore centered. And so, you know, you've got the very historical setting of like a small village in wintertime in Russia, and in this one the kind of magic and everything really only comes out through folklore stories, and it's not super heavy-handed, but it is really there. And I think it's just a good idea to kind of like get a good taste of like different fantasy creatures and different stories that often pop up actually in, you know, our fantasy stories today. You know, we take a lot from folklore, and so I think that this is just a really good start. It's very atmospheric, and I did really enjoy this first book. Like I said, there are 2 other books in the series. There's The Girl in the Tower and The Winter of the Witch. I personally like this first one better, and I think that it can mostly stand on its own, but if you do end up really liking this one, I do encourage you to check out the other 2. And then the other historical fantasy that I have to recommend is The Library of Legends by Janie. So this is set during World War II, and it follows a group of university students in China as they have to kind of evacuate their coastal city and move more inland. This is actually a real thing that happened, and Jane takes a lot of kind of little stories and anecdotes and pictures that she has read and seen from this time period and integrated it into this story. So it feels just very like raw and just very realistic. But as these students are evacuating towards the center of the country, they are charged with carrying this Library of Legends. It's a series of ancient texts that house all the different legends of China, and the stories of all the different gods and creatures, and as they are taking these texts with them as they move inland, a couple of the students start to see the legends kind of migrating with them closer inland. So again, the fantasy in this book I think is a lot more subtle than it is in The Bear and the Nightingale, and so this is definitely a lot more historical fiction with like a little dash of fantasy, but I think it's a really good way of kind of giving you a good little taste of what many fantasy stories are, again with the folklore inspiration, and how that's a very common theme in the genre these days, and this just kind of talks about several different Chinese folklore, but again, I think if you're looking for more of just a subtle taste of fantasy, I think this is a good place to start. And then kind of the next section that I think is a good place to maybe explore is YA fantasy standalones. Many of these are going to be kind of higher fantasy, maybe set in their own world, not necessarily our world, or they may take kind of vague inspiration from our world to give it a basis, but a lot of it is then created up from the imagination of the author. But I think that YA standalones are a really good place to start because the story is so contained. They're typically not super long. Adult standalones can definitely get much lengthier. My favorite one being The Priory of the Orange Tree. That one's over 800 pages, but that one I think is definitely very hard to pick up brand new to the genre, so that's why I recommend YA standalones as opposed to adult standalones. Typically, since they're not nearly as long, range anywhere from maybe 300 to 500 pages. You know, the world building is not going to be nearly as intricate, neither is the plot. The plot is probably going to be a little more linear, and so I think that that's just a good place to start. For instance, the first one that I have to recommend was one I just finished recently, and that is The Dark Tide by Alicia Jacinska. This gives kind of a very vague feel of being maybe inspired by our own real world, and it gives kind of this like 1920s-esque vibe to it, which kind of helps give you like an anchor point in the story, and in the world. So this is about like an island nation that every year they have to sacrifice one boy to the witch queen. This nation is ruled by witches, and then one witch queen who rules all of them, and she then has to fall in love with this boy, and then at the end of the month sacrifice him to the dark tide in order to prevent the island nation from drowning. And I think that this is it's a very vibrant book, and it gives you like a good taste of what fantasy kind of gives in terms of like its richness and kind of the imaginativeness. And like, this is a short one, so the plot is not too intricate, the world building is not too intricate, but I think that it is well developed enough that like you can definitely sink yourself into this story. The magic system isn't necessarily like supernatural powers or like anything like that. It's more kind of like witchy magic based around like knot tying and hair and things. So I think that that's kind of like a good kind of way to ease yourself into the idea of having magic systems in books. Some of them can get pretty convoluted, but I think this one's pretty simple enough to understand and pick up. And then the other standalone that I have is Girl, Serpent, and Thorne by Melissa Bashadoust. So this is actually inspired by Persian folklore, so it's kind of along the same lines as like historical fiction. However, this fantasy world definitely feels much more like a high fantasy world than necessarily like our historical world. I kind of wanted to recommend this one because it has a very fairy tale-esque feel to it, and that's why I really enjoyed it. I think that a good place to start in fantasy if you're looking to jump right into a lot of richly magical and whimsical stories is to kind of pick up stories that feel like traditional fairy tales, because they kind of reminded me, at least, of like childhood and kind of growing up with those whimsical stories. This is about a young girl who she was cursed at a very young age that nobody can touch her, and if anybody touches her they die because she's poisonous to the touch. So she's sequestered away in her quarters in the palace, basically like a lavish prison. Her family recently captured a demon and they are imprisoned in the dungeons, and she thinks that this demon can help her break her curse. And so that's kind of where the story takes off. Like I said, it's a very fairy tale-esque feel, and I think just that like traditional fairy tale feel kind of gives a sense of nostalgia, and I think will really draw you into the overall genre of fantasy pretty quickly. So then if you are actually wanting to dive in and have a little bit more of an intricate plot, maybe more of a drawn out world building, I would definitely recommend YA fantasy series. So the first one that I recommend is the Gracelane Realm series, the first book being Gracelane by Kristen Cashore. Now if you've watched one of my previous videos, you're probably thinking, hold on Sarah, you didn't like this book. Yes, I didn't like it because I read a lot of fantasy. However, I do think it's a good book to pick up if you are brand new to the genre and wanting to kind of get a taste of what higher fantasy series can be like. This plot is very linear. There are several very common fantasy tropes in here. The magic system is quite interesting, but it's not overly complex. And I just think that this is a good kind of stepping stone and beginners series to pick up. And then the next one that I have to recommend is one that lots of people have read, and that is the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. Now this is kind of a more daunting one to pick up right away because it's like 8 books long. However, the reason why I recommend this is because it really eases you slowly into the complexity of this story. The beginning book starts out deceivingly simple in terms of plot and kind of world building and magic system, and as the series progresses, more and more things get revealed and unraveled, and this world just like gradually opens up and kind of really sucks you in. Same with the plot and the intricacies of the plot. This first book, it's a pretty linear plot. However, by the end of it, you've got a couple of big reveals that will then carry into the second book, and things start to get much more entangled going forward. But like I said, I just think it's a good way to really ease yourself into this kind of a story and kind of what epic fantasies have to offer. Many epic fantasies really just like push you off a cliff and you have to learn how to fly right away. However, I really do think this one kind of gives you the feeling of like training wheels, and it slowly removes them and you don't even realize. So I definitely would recommend this one. So then if you're like, well, I'm not interested in YA, I want to dive right into adult fantasy series, I do have 2 that I think are good for people who are still newer to the genre, but they're up to a bit more of a challenge. The first one is the Shades of Magic trilogy trilogy. The first book being A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. So I'm recommending this one actually because Em over at I Forgot Salt, I will link her channel down below, highly recommend checking her out. She's super sweet and super funny. She was talking about this series recently, and she really loved it and actually thinks that it is a very good one for people who are new to the fantasy genre because it deals with 4 different parallel Londons, one of them being our own London, and so you get that sense of like grounding in the world building, and then you can branch yourself out from there when our characters explore the other parallel Londons. This is just a really fun book. This one is also another one that gave me this sense of nostalgia. It definitely has like an adult fiction feel to it, but there's this underlying childlike feel to the story. I don't know how else to describe it, but I was filled with a lot of nostalgia when I read this series, and I really enjoyed it. I definitely think that it's another one where the first book starts out relatively linear in terms of plot, and as the series continues into the second and third book, it definitely becomes a bit more intricate, especially by the third book, and so again, this is a good one to just kind of like slowly integrate yourself into the intricacies of fantasy plot lines. So then this last recommendation that I have, I think is definitely one if people are up for a challenge, and that is the Daevabad trilogy, the first one being The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. The reason why I say that this one's a bit more of a challenge is because it is definitely a high fantasy, but it's also a very political fantasy, and I think political fantasies can be pretty hard to get into unless it's like a subgenre of fantasy that you really enjoy, only because it becomes very intricate in terms of like different character relationships and multiple plot lines happening at the same time. However, I think Chakraborty pulls this off in just an amazing way. This is definitely a series to really sink your teeth in. This is a trilogy, and the books are all pretty long. This one's like over 500 pages, and I think by the third one you're like close to 800 pages. So it's a really rich world, really rich magic system, and rich political system, but I don't think it's necessarily overwhelming in the beginning, especially because our main character is kind of brand new to this world that she is diving in along with you, and so that kind of helps because you're kind of learning alongside of your main character. But yeah, I think if you are new to fantasy and wanting to jump right in with a challenge, I would highly recommend The City of Brass. So those are the books that I recommend to anyone who's brand new to the fantasy genre and wanting to kind of start getting their feet wet. Hopefully there's something in that list for you. Let me know if you're looking for any more recommendations. I'd be happy to give some, or if you've read any of these books, if you have any recommendations to add to the list, let me know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing, but as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!